Children are a treasure from the Lord.
Gender neutrality is a heated topic when it comes to Bible translation, and I've seen a lot of people argue about the issue. I never cease to be surprised, and I find it really humorous as I study different translations, and there are things that just really surprise you in terms of how different translations render different phrases, and sometimes it's really the opposite of what you would expect for that particular translation. And that's what I want to look at in this video. It's really interesting. We're looking at Psalm 127 verses 3 to 5, and you can look it up in different translations, see how it translates a certain word here that we're going to look at. And you'll see here, this is the New English translation. It says, "Yes, sons are a gift from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Sons born during one's youth are like arrows in a warrior's hand. How blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. They will not be put to shame when they confront enemies at the city gate." Now I want to compare that to what the King James Version says. And a lot of you are familiar with this. It says, "Lo, children are a heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, and they shall speak with the enemies in the gate." So which one of these is actually gender specific and which one is gender neutral? In this case, it's the King James that is gender neutral. So I want to do a couple things here. First, I want to look at the notes of the New English translation. Then I want to look at the Hebrew behind what these translations are translating here. So let's look at the notes here. It says in the NET notes, "Some prefer to translate this term with the gender neutral children, but sons are plainly in view here, as the following verses make clear. Daughters are certainly wonderful additions to a family, but in ancient Israelite culture, sons were the arrows that gave a man security in his old age, for they could defend the family interests at the city gate, where the legal and economic issues of the community were settled." And then for the next verse, like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are sons of youth. Arrows are used in combat to defend oneself against enemies. Sons are viewed here as providing social security and protection. So really, it's not only that they just chose to be gender specific, it really is making a point here about the security of having sons versus having daughters. Now that is partly, a cultural thing and how their culture operated, but it's partly something that you could make the case for today, that in general men are stronger and are able to protect, if there's some sort of a physical altercation or something like that, or something of that nature because of their physical strength. But anyway, I just think it's interesting here, the case that's being made for a gender-specific translation when you have in the King James Version a gender-neutral translation, "Children are a heritage of the Lord." And a lot of people use that verse just to say it's great that God blesses us with children, and that's true. But what the NET notes are saying is it's really specifically in this passage referring to sons. Now, I find this even more interesting when you look at the Hebrew, and I'm looking here at blueletterbible.org, and you'll see here that the New American Standard Bible 95 edition translates in Psalm 127, like the King James, it translates this word as children. And the word here is benim. And when we pull it up here, it says it's a noun, common, masculine, plural, absolute. In the English here, it's rendered children. But if you go to another verse, and again, we're looking at the NASB 95 rendering of the Hebrew, it says here, "Then the days of Adam after he became the father of Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters." And what do you think the word for sons there is? we go to the Hebrew here, once again you have benim, and it's the noun, common masculine, plural, absolute. In this context, it's clearly going to be rendered sons because next to it you have the word for daughters. It is a masculine term though. But in Psalm 127 verse 3, the NASB renders that same term as children. So the NET is saying it should actually be rendered sons, and a lot of times in the NASB in the Old Testament you will see sons when you have that term benim. But in this case, the New American Standard rendered it children, which is following what the King James did. If you look at the American Standard Version, it also followed the tradition of the King James there. It says children are a heritage of the Lord. And the American Standard Version is known for being very literal. And yet here, which one is more literal? I would say in this case it's actually the NET. What about the English Standard Version? We see here it goes with the tradition. I think that was really started by the King James Version. People are used to hearing this. Children are a heritage from the Lord, and the English Standard Version follows that same rendering. As I said, the New American Standard 95 says, "Behold, children are a gift of the Lord." So it renders in this passage benim as children. Now this is where it gets kind of humorous because, like I said at the beginning, a lot of times in translation you come to expect certain things. And if I were to ask you which translations are not gender neutral and which translations are gender neutral, one of the translations that would be described as gender neutral would be the New Revised Standard Version. And yet here we see it rendered the way the NET talks about it being rendered. Sons are indeed a heritage from the Lord. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the sons of one's youth. So I find this almost humorous, just the way that that these different translations kind of fall on this particular passage. Now, what about the Legacy Standard Bible? I mean, that's a very literal translation. How would that render this passage? So let's go to that. And we see here, "Behold, children are an inheritance of Yahweh. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth." That's the Legacy Standard Bible. So again, it's not actually the most literal, gender-specific rendering of this passage. I also want to point out here the Revised Standard Version also translates this as sons. Sons are a heritage from the Lord. So that is probably where the translation and the reasoning for putting sons here was started, and that carried over to the New Revised Standard Version. It was also picked up in the NET. And also the Christian Standard Bible here has "sons are indeed a heritage from the Lord." And the Christian Standard Bible is one of those translations that has been accused of going more gender neutral, and yet here again it's kind of funny. You're actually seeing the more gender neutral translations actually be more gender specific in this passage, and the less gender neutral translations be more gender neutral in this specific passage. The NIV, though, I think it's good to just look at this, does say children are a heritage from the Lord. So that is what probably people would expect there. The NIV often, though, does carry on the tradition of past translations, even from the King James Version. They do a lot of times use phraseology that people are familiar with, or they borrow a little bit from familiar traditional phrasing. So I think that's what you're getting here. And the New Living Translation, children are a gift from the Lord. So it's really a mixed bag when you look at all these different translations. But again, the New Revised Standard Version has sons here, whereas the English Standard Version, the New American Standard, the KJV have children. So what's going on here? If the NET is right in its reasoning for rendering this as sons, and the Hebrew here does have sons, benim, then why are so many translations translating it as children? And I think you could hear in what I was saying my guess as to why these translations translate it as children. It's really just tradition. It's what people are used to. I think the King James Version translated it that way, which wasn't necessarily a bad translation, but it is more of a gender-neutral translation, and that carried over with translations that, yes, are often trying to be literal, but they are also translations that are consciously trying to carry on the tradition of the past. And so the tradition was to say children are a heritage from the Lord. But the more modern translations, and ironically, often the more gender-neutral ones, are the ones more willing to go with sons here. So there you go. You learn a lot as you look at different translations, and you see that there are a lot of times more nuances and differences in the translations than you would expect. When you hear the debates, when you hear people arguing and they say, well, that translation is, and they fill in the blank with some remark about that translation, it really may be a mixed bag. There may be more to it than what people are saying. And I think you see that in a passage like this. I'm curious, though, for those of you who have made it this far, what do you think is the correct rendering? And I want you to be honest with yourself. If you didn't know which translations went with which rendering, what would you say looking at the Hebrew and looking at the point that's being made here by the New English Translation notes about sons being security for people who lived in this culture? I think, to me, looking at it objectively and trying to be more literal, it does make sense here to put sons. And yet, a lot of the more traditional translations put children. But I'm curious what you think about that. Be interesting to hear other people's perspectives on this. Did this surprise you? And if it did it kind of change your thinking on some of these translations in any way? I hope to stretch all of our thinking. I find this stuff fascinating and, again, sometimes even humorous. Let me know what you think in the comments below. But thank you so much for taking some time to listen to some of my thoughts on this, brought to you from A Frisch Perspective.